Good day, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our session on bringing elephants into the room, why UNFCCC needs to put animals on the table. My name is Mark Halle. I'm the chair of the Global Rewilding Alliance, one of the partners in organizing this event. And I'd like to welcome both those who are present here in the room and those who have joined us online. We are going to explore an emerging opportunity that is generating quite a bit of excitement in the world of biodiversity and climate change, and that is how the restoration of animal populations can advance linked climate and biodiversity agendas. We all know that to address climate change, and indeed to address nature loss, we need to bring down emissions. But that will not be enough on its own. We also need to sequester carbons in sinks and reservoirs. In looking at that, we have tended to focus on habitats. We've looked at how reforestation can help sequester carbon and store it. But we have not looked enough at the potential for restoration of ecosystems in their full diversity, and whether that has a significantly greater potential to sequester atmospheric carbon. As you probably all know, there's been a considerable gain in momentum of the rewilding movement, and the Global Rewilding Alliance tries to federate those organizations that are focused on rewilding in different parts of the world and very different experiences. But much of that is on private land or in large ecosystems like the restoration of the American bison. What is emerging is an increasingly robust science that is telling us that trophic rewilding, or supporting of highly sophisticated ecosystems with the presence of large animals, actually has a very considerable potential. And although there are case studies and pilots, they increasingly are looking at the possibility of different animals in ecosystems to address the climate and biodiversity challenge together. Now, we can all imagine how ensuring that the musk oxen roams the tundra in the high Arctic can help us sequester carbon. The challenge is not so much that. The challenge is in addressing animals in areas with human communities. So we know that the success in what we call trophic rewilding will depend very much on how well we work with the communities, how well we deal with wildlife-human interactions, wildlife-human conflicts. And if we are successful at that, we think that we can spread the examples of trophic rewilding very broadly across land and ocean and aquatic ecosystems. So the secret of all this is how well we are able to build a bottom-up movement, not imposing rewilding or focusing on case studies of rewilding on large private estates, as has often been the case. So we have a very distinguished panel this morning, and I would like to start by asking Dr. Reem Al-Meala to offer us some opening remarks. Reem is a marine biologist from Bahrain and is very much involved in her country's efforts to implement the Biodiversity Convention. She is working on she's the project manager for the revision of the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan, so is very familiar with the challenges that we face, and of course, as a marine biologist, is very sensitive to the contribution of the ocean environment. So please, Reem.
Thank you so much. Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, and ladies and gentlemen, good morning to you all. I'd like to start with a quote by Edward Abbey that says, "Wilderness is not a luxury, but a necessity for human spirit." We live in a world that is racing against time. There is a current obsession with carbon capture as a means of preventing climate warming beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius. And there is a major focus on embracing technology, AI, and building machines in the name of mitigating and adapting to climate change. The importance of restoring biodiversity to address the climate crisis is quite well known. However, the natural world is yet again put aside, and when mentioned, is in the bottom of the list in many cases. We speak of nature-based solutions. However, the question that begs itself is, are we actually creating space for nature to rewild itself, or come back, rejuvenate, and restore its spirit? There is evidence of natural climate solutions that shows natural biogeochemical processes within terrestrial and marine ecosystems that already remove up to 50% of all human-caused carbon dioxide emissions annually. These annual climate solutions focus on protection and restoring plants, so think trees, mangroves, seagrass, and soil and sediment microbes in ecosystem, think Save the Soil campaign. This is mainly because protecting forests, wetlands, and coastal and green grassland ecosystems avoids emissions of 4 gigatons of carbon dioxide per year, and by restoring and managing plants, soil, and sediments in these ecosystems enables the capture and storage of 5 to 6 gigatons of carbon dioxide. I just thought I'd mention numbers because numbers are important, provide a bit of insight. However, wild animals, especially terrestrial and marine mammals and marine fish, can also have consequential effects. The science shows that protecting and restoring wild animals and their functional roles can enhance natural carbon capture and storage. And hence, I'm here today to support the many champions, also my global brothers and sisters, in flying the flag for wild animals as a key component of natural climate solutions that enhance the ability to prevent climate warming beyond the 1.5 degrees Celsius. If you look at nature-based solutions that are popular today, let us take mangroves, for example, and just an analogy to serve as food for thought. If we work on restoring and conserving mangroves as a carbon sink system while overlooking the animals that live in it, so they will not really function to their highest potential. This is because we are approaching them as a landscape system rather than a functional system. So think of a human skeleton that we're putting together, and we've decided not to add the organs to it. And yet we expect that skeleton to function like a normal human, whatever normal means. It makes no sense, does it? So we must change matters and enlist the functional role of animals for natural climate solution. This also means that we must shift and change the current mindset into one which largely holds wild animals that need to be protected from human impacts and climate change. This includes landscapes and seascape spaces for animal conservation and natural climate solutions. Every era of climate negotiations, you hear these buzzwords that are mentioned. One is made to be felt like you're part of that process. So you go into these negotiations or side events, and there are these popular words, right? Biofinance, ocean economy. You know, you feel fancy when you use them. Nature positive, blue entrepreneurship. So it's important to keep up with these words as we transit to the next stage. So why not just add a new one, right? So let's add animating the carbon cycle, which refers to using wild animal conservation explicitly to enhance carbon capture and storage. Fancy, right? If you are wondering how this even works, today's session will provide some insights examples. Everything is interconnected. Thus, embracing a dynamic landscape and seascape perspective is strongly required when working at the nexus of climate solutions, of biodiversity conservation, and humans to coexist. So rather than separating people from nature, people forget that they are part of nature. So in the Arabian Gulf, where we are right now, also referred to as the Persian Gulf, because everybody likes their own identity, and the UN have decided we are the Roke-Me Sea area to keep everybody happy, you know, no problem, whatever word you would like to use. The point is, my ancestors, who are Arabian Bedouins and moved around the Arabian Peninsula, were very, very connected with nature. People forget, for example, that deserts also have their own animals. And the funny thing is, we were so interconnected that our ancestors could actually navigate the deserts that if you've ever been in a true pristine desert, you would not know where you are, but the stars would tell them. And they knew where fresh water was just by knowing, oh, there's a dragonfly, water is nearby, the oasis is just ahead, so follow the dragonfly. My name is Reem. Reem in Arabic means the Arabian gazelle. Even our names were embedded as part of nature, because that is the spirit that we channel, not just from our ancestors, but also our greatest teacher. So natural climate solutions are becoming fundamental to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement, while creating added opportunity to enhance biodiversity conservation. Therefore, it is crucial that animals be given a seat on the negotiation table. Trophic rewilding for natural carbon solutions requires rethinking rules and procedures of the existing governance intended to reduce emissions and enhance carbon storage. Wild animals and their incredible ecosystems have been throughout time and space part of the Earth's climate regulation process, and yet have again been overlooked. It is time for change, and we must work together to introduce a new approach and way of thinking when working on climate solutions. Thank you for your attention, and I really look forward to the discussions today.
Thank you very much, Reem. You've gotten off to a wonderful start, both by recognizing that this is a new and exciting area of human knowledge that we're beginning to understand the dimensions of, but also for pointing out that at the base of it all are the values that we defend, the values that serve to help us interact with the planet in a positive way. And I think that's a very important message which will be repeated, I think, many times through this session. You referred to the emerging knowledge around trophic rewilding and its potential, and some of the most important work on that subject has been led by Dr. Oswald Schmitz of the Yale School of Environment. Dr. Schmitz has published a very important article on trophic rewilding last year with a number of co-authors, which has, in a sense, summarized where we are on our scientific understanding, but also starting to build models that will enable us to actually try and measure and offer these solutions in a more practical way. I'd like to ask Dr. Schmitz, or Oz, to proceed with your presentation. And I believe if you would, I can click to the next slide if you tell me just next slide, and I'll do that. Oz, can you hear us? Are you there?
Thank you very much, Mark. Yes, I can hear you. Hopefully you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Thank you all for joining this session this morning. I'm happy to present what I think is an important contribution to help address an important challenge. I can't see the slides, Mark, so I'm assuming it's the slide with the moose on it that you're showing?
That's correct, and if you just tell me when to move to the next one, I will do that.
Okay, so move to the next slide, please.
Done.
So the fundamental challenge that we're facing is that even if we were to reach net zero emissions, which is a big ambition of the IPCC and COP meetings, if we were to reach net zero emissions by 2050, which is an ambitious goal, we still risk exceeding a global temperature rise above 1.5 degrees C. And the reason for this is because there's still a huge amount of CO2 in the atmosphere that's going to continue to trap the heat. The IPCC estimates that's at about 440 to 500 gigatons of atmospheric CO2 still there that we would have to remove between now and 2100 in order to achieve limiting temperature rise to 1.5 degrees C. If you do the math, it adds up to about 10 to 12 gigatons of CO2 that you have to remove from the atmosphere and store somewhere on the planet each year between now and 2100. Next slide, please.
Got it.
What people have proposed is using nature as a place to capture and store that carbon. And you know, people are calling this natural climate solutions or nature-based solutions. And there are two aspects of natural climate solutions that we can deal with. One is avoided emissions. That is, we need to protect the ecosystems we already have that are holding the carbon and taking up the carbon so we don't exacerbate the problem and re-release CO2 to the atmosphere. But the other aspect of it is enhancing the sinks. And that is through enhancing forests, enhancing other habitats, including wetlands, changing our agricultural practices, being very careful about managing landscapes so that we enhance the vegetation quality of those habitats. And between the two, we can end up getting about 5 gigatons of protected CO2 per year, and then an additional 5 gigatons of CO2 uptake and storage per year. But you'll remember what we need to do is capture about 10 to 12 per year. So we're falling short right now in terms of enhancing sinks. And so we need to think about other ways. Next slide, please.
It's up.
So one of the things that's conspicuously absent in the discussions is the animals, right? We're talking about ecosystems, we're talking about restoring vegetation and everything, but there's no image of animals other than domestic cattle in any of these figures. Next slide, please.
It's up.
One of the reasons why we haven't been considering animals is because of sort of a classic paradigm that drives a lot of the biogeosciences that actually think about carbon dynamics, and that is in ecology we know about the classic trophic pyramid of biomass or numbers, and what that means is that plants and soil microbes are vastly more important, by orders of magnitude more abundant in terms of their biomass or abundance than animals. And if you separate animals into herbivores or predators, you know, the numbers even diminish further. What people argue based on that is that the animals are not abundant enough to embody enough carbon storage to make a difference. And so people have ignored animals because they don't think of them as a useful way of storing additional carbon. The problem with that thinking is that it ignores the feedback effects, the dynamism that Reem talked about. You know, there are feedback effects that the animals have on those bigger pools, the bigger carbon pools of plants and soils. And when you think about those feedbacks, animals can have quite outsized effects, disproportionately larger effects than their abundance would suggest. And so, you know, this is the point of animating the carbon cycle, is enlisting that dynamism and thinking about that. Next slide, please.
Done.
Some examples of how that might work. So here we're thinking of an Arctic ecosystem, and we heard about, you know, muskox and caribou or reindeer. In the absence of those creatures, what we have is a landscape that really becomes lush with shrub vegetation, and the snowpack can get quite high. And what that vegetation does is absorbs solar radiation and warms the soil in spring, so you get earlier spring warming. The snowpack actually prevents the cold ambient air from penetrating through down to the soil, the permafrost, and so you get permafrost melting and microbial decomposition of organic matter in that permafrost is anaerobic, so you get a release of methane to the atmosphere, which is a very potent greenhouse gas. With the presence of the animals, what they do is they eat the vegetation and they trample the snowpack, and so you get a very thin layer. It doesn't have a good insulative value, and so you get a deep penetration of the cold air, the Arctic air, maintaining that permafrost. So these animals actually protect soil carbon into permafrost form. Next slide, please.
Done. It's up.
In grassland ecosystems, what you have is, in the absence of animals like bison and elk, you have a certain amount of grassland productivity, but you also get very slow recycling of nutrients in that grassland. If you add these herbivores in their presence, what they do by their grazing, they actually stimulate plant productivity. So you get more production, means more carbon uptake into the vegetation. And they also end up through urination and defecation, they're recycling nutrients, and these nutrients are easily taken up by plants much faster than if they had to go through decomposition by microbes, and so it boosts the productivity. You get fast recycling of nutrients, and together the productivity and the fast recycling also stimulate more biomass, plant biomass that enters the soil for storage. So they can boost soil carbon storage in grassland ecosystems. Next slide, please.
It's up.
In boreal forest ecosystems, we have wolves and moose and forest trees, but in the absence of wolves, for example, moose can become highly abundant. They can, through their browsing, can change the stand structure of the forest, the tree species composition. And they also thin the forest, and so what ends up happening is that the soil gets warmed, and the microbial action results in fast decomposition of organic matter and release as CO2. You add the wolves in, they control moose abundance. There's less pressure on the forest vegetation structure, the species composition of the forest changes, favoring trees that take up carbon a lot better. And what you end up having is cooler soil, so microbial decomposition decreases, and so you end up getting much more storage of organic carbon in the soil that doesn't get decomposed. Next slide, please.
It's up.
One of the best places actually that we're discovering to capture and store carbon is the ocean, both coastal ocean systems and deep ocean systems. In coastal ocean systems, we've got mangroves, we've got seagrasses, we've got kelp forests, we've got coral reefs. They all contain species interactions that actually control the amount of carbon taken up and stored in sediments in much similar ways to what we see in forests and other terrestrial systems. And out in the deep ocean, what you do is you get, cycling of fish species, especially going into the deep ocean and then coming up to the surface through diel migrations. They release nutrients in the surface waters that stimulate plankton production. The plankton take up the CO2 in the atmosphere, from the atmosphere, the particulates after the phytoplankton die float down to the ocean, deep ocean. Fish also release calcite through saltwater metabolism. That calcite is a heavy rocky substance that also sinks to the seafloor for carbon storage, and also the embodied carbon in their animal tissues that sink to the ocean floor when they die. These are really important, especially the mesopelagic zone, the twilight zone, just below the surface waters, where the most fish are present in the ocean. Next slide, please.
There.
Perhaps the most popular emblem or ambassador for ocean carbon cycling is the whale pump, or the cycling of whales. I'm not going to get into that. My colleague, Dr. Heidi Pearson, will talk about that a little bit after my presentation. Next slide, please. There are also ecosystem effects that can happen in tropical forests. And again, I'm not going to get into that. Dr. Andrew Tilker, my other colleague, will present after I finish this presentation to talk about what may happen in tropical forest ecosystems. Next slide, please.
There.
So, you know, one of the things that becomes true of all of this is that the animals, regardless of ecosystem type, regardless of species, regardless of functional type, there are a limited number of ways that the animals impact ecosystems, but they're pretty uniform across all ecosystems, and that's through their foraging, through their defecation, through carbon uptake and release and storage, through frugivory and seed dispersal, through grazing effects. And as you can see, they are pretty consistent among ecosystems. The dominance of one or the other effect really depends on the species that you're considering. But what's really coming clear is that there are commonalities among ecosystems where in the ways that animals can impact carbon uptake and storage. Next slide, please. So what do the numbers actually suggest? Well, what we find is that if we do the math, and these data are based on an assessment of what carbon uptake would be in the absence of animals, what the carbon uptake in the presence of animals is, and then the net difference. So the numbers here are the net differences. This is what the animal presence actually adds to existing carbon uptake in ecosystems. And there are two ways, again, avoided emissions. These are species that currently exist in natural ecosystems. And if you look at the numbers, we end up with 5.8 gigatons of CO2 per year that's taken up because of these sets of animals here. It matches the amount of avoided emissions that other nature-based solutions have discussed. What's interesting, though, is none of these animals actually figure explicitly into the calculation of existing nature-based solutions. They might be implicitly included, but not explicitly, but in some cases they're not at all included, especially the marine realm. And the more important one is, the problem with this is because they're not accounted for, there's an existential risk that we can actually lose these species and then actually lose the carbon uptake capacity. Wolves are being culled globally, and other species like sea otters are threatened with culling because they compete with fisheries. The other thing is, speaking of fisheries, the most important contribution in the marine realm is species from the twilight zone or the mesopelagic zone, where you have a lot of fish. The bulk of ocean fish biomass is in that zone. It is not fished currently, but the decline of coastal fisheries is encouraging people to move into the twilight zone and actually start harvesting those fish. Those fish contribute about 5.4 of the 5.8 gigatons per year of fish contributions. So it's a really important area. It's kind of worrisome that people are wanting to start exploiting that part of the ocean, and we need to think about better ways to protect that realm of fish in the ocean. Next slide, please.
There.
Here are some numbers. They're modest numbers for a few animals, but these are additional enhanced sinks that these animals can contribute if we restore some of these populations. This is sort of the tip of the iceberg. These numbers are not at all included in the enhanced sink estimates, but the numbers rival the enhanced sink estimates, so we're in the same ballpark. And again, as I say, this is the tip of the iceberg. What we need to do is really start assessing more and more animals. Next slide, please.
Yep.
So, what we do need is a change in mindset. Right now, the attitude is that climate change is seen as a way of being harmful to animal species. Animals are viewed as unwitting victims of climate change on a ship that's headed on an ill-fated voyage. A change in mindset that sees animals as important drivers of the ship. And conservation through trophic rewilding may be a way to change that problem that animals are being ignored. Next slide, please.
Yep.
one of the things is, animals are hidden in plain sight. The issue is if you don't quantify the animal effects, then you don't manage or conserve the animal species. And so what we actually need to do is a better job of really thinking about what animals are contributing in terms of ecosystem carbon capture and storage. Next slide.
Got it.
So to this end, my research group and I have developed a new carbon cycle model that does include animal effects. You'll notice on the bottom, we build on traditional classic carbon cycle models that include plants and the soils, especially soil microbial processes. And so we're thinking of photosynthesis, we think about plant respiration, we think about soil respiration, nutrient leaching. And again, consistent with classic carbon cycle models, we're thinking about nutrients and carbon together because nutrients are important in driving the carbon cycle. We think about plant recycling of nutrients, but then we layer animals on top of that, the herbivore trophic level that eats the plants, and we account for animal respiration and animal recycling feedbacks that through the nutrient deposition that they contribute, as well as the carnivores that control the animal abundances but also cause feedbacks. Now you might think this is a very simplified model, there's a huge diversity of animals, and is this an oversimplification that isn't going to do us the important service that we need? Next slide, please.
Yep.
We are at a point, though, where we can build out the model now and include trophic complexity, species diversity. We do that in terms of functional types. For example, in terms of herbivores, we might think of herbivores as grazers or browsers or mixed feeders. And then they have different impacts on the ecosystem, so we account for those different impacts as well. With different predators and different hunting modes, they also impact animals and ecosystems differently. Next slide, please.
It's up.
The ultimate aim is to really build out a quantitative understanding of different ecosystems on the planet and the animals that are in that, and try and identify potential hotspots for carbon storage using trophic rewilding as a mechanism to enhance carbon storage, and actually identify the species and the ecosystems where there will be huge value added globally, and that is intended to help inform the conversation about where we might need to prioritize efforts to conserve ecosystems and species. So with that, thank you very much for listening in, and I look forward to further discussion.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Oz, for making a very compelling case for animating the carbon cycle for trophic rewilding. I think with that general background, I'd now like to turn to other members of the panel who will give us examples from different ecosystems. First, Dr. Andrew Tilker, who works for Rewild. He is one of the team working with Oz to build this model. And he will give us a number of terrestrial examples of animal ecosystem function. Andrew, over to you. Andrew?
Thanks, everyone,
yeah.
And thank you for, good? Well, thank you, everyone, for your attention, and thank you, Oz, for your excellent overview into the science that underpins animating the carbon cycle. Next slide, please.
Yep. Just assume that the slides are up when you ask for a new one.
Great. I'll be speaking through a few examples from the terrestrial realm, and especially from tropical forest ecosystems. Now, one of the primary ways that animals impact forest ecosystems is as important seed dispersers. Many large and medium-sized mammals and birds feed on fruit. Those seeds pass through the animal, and then they're deposited often very far away from the original location where the seed was consumed, and with a bundle of nutrients, i.e. the dung, wrapped around it, which helps germination. And so by consuming seeds and spreading them out across a forest landscape, these animals are integral to maintaining healthy forest ecosystems. Next, please. A number of studies in recent years within tropical ecosystems have now shown that the seeds that are most likely to be consumed and dispersed by large mammals and birds are exactly those trees that store the most carbon. So these trees have large seeds that are primarily, or in some cases only, dispersed by larger animal species. And they're characterized by dense wood that is especially important for long-term carbon storage. These studies indicate that with the extinction of large frugivores within tropical forests, the forest composition fundamentally changes with a shift to softwood trees that store less carbon. And you can see this on the figure that is shown on the screen. On the left, you have a forest with healthy large animal communities, a so-called non-defaunated forest. And this forest has abundant large hardwood trees that store the most carbon. On the right, on the other hand, you have a forest that has lost its large animals. It's lost its large mammals, it's lost its large birds. This is what we refer to as a defaunated forest. And this forest is dominated by softwood trees that store less CO2. And again, the reason why the empty forest has less hardwood trees is because those trees need large animals for dispersal. If you take away the large animals, you also take away these important carbon storing trees. Next, please. If you multiply over large landscapes, for example, across the entire Amazon or the forests of Southeast Asia, the net result is significant. Now, the example that I spoke about a minute ago refers to the effects of removing these animals from forest ecosystems. But the opposite of this is also true. If we actively restore animal populations, we can restore healthy ecosystems that in turn remove more carbon from the atmosphere and thus get us closer to that 6 to 7 gigatons of CO2 per year that Oz mentioned that we need to be taking out of the atmosphere. Now, global large mammal declines have been especially severe in the tropics. A recent study estimated that across tropical ecosystems, mammal populations are partly defaunated or partly emptied in approximately 50% of the world's tropical forests, which works out to about 14 million kilometers squared, with especially large declines in places like West Africa and Southeast Asia. And that's the figure that I'm showing on the map, with red areas indicating forests that are emptied or mostly emptied of large mammals. Now, that emptying of large mammal and bird species from the world's tropical forests is a biodiversity tragedy. There's no question about it. Next slide, please. But this also means that there are large areas of the planet that can be rewilded, and therefore there's an incredible potential, there's an amazing opportunity for restoring terrestrial animal communities in these tropical forests as a key component to more holistic nature-based solutions. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your time, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I'm going to come back to all the panelists with questions after the series of presentations, but I'd now like to introduce Dr. Heidi Pearson from the University of Alaska Southeast, and she will focus on the role of marine mammals in oceans ecosystems.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. Thanks for coming, and thanks for my co-panelists for setting up the state of the science so well. So I'm pleased to discuss my research on the role of marine mammal recovery in forming a nature-positive vision. There are many benefits to marine mammal conservation. Marine mammals as a whole are umbrella species for conservation, and so if we protect them, we can inherently protect many parts of their ecosystem. So first and foremost, they have numerous intrinsic, cultural, spiritual, and moral values. They are also ecosystem engineers capable of transforming their environment. They help to enhance biodiversity and increase ecosystem health, productivity, and resilience. What is less known are their potential climate benefits, and that was the topic of a paper I published last year with respect to whales and the carbon cycle. This figure depicts the various ecosystem functioning roles of marine vertebrates, and marine mammals play a role in 5 of these, which are highlighted. So I'll briefly describe these, but I encourage you to visit our story map to learn more. Trophic cascade carbon describes how sea otters can promote kelp forest growth. Through the whale pump and the great whale conveyor belt, cetaceans release nutrients and their byproducts that fertilize surface waters that can be taken up by phytoplankton. This not only enhances ecosystem functioning, but it can enhance carbon capture, storage, and sequestration. Through biomass carbon, cetaceans can store large amounts of carbon in their bodies for long periods of time. And then when they die, those carcasses sink to the seafloor, forming what we call deadfall carbon. And here, that carbon can be sequestered for thousands of years, potentially longer. So moving on to some of the work I'm doing at my field sites in Alaska, I'm studying how sea otters help to promote kelp forest growth. So sea otters are voracious predators, and one of their favorite prey items are sea urchins. If there are fewer sea urchins, kelp forests grow and flourish, providing a lot of coastal habitat, which also can be important carbon sinks. We've been studying the growth in kelp throughout Southeast Alaska, where sea otters are recolonizing portions of their former range. However, the increase in sea otter populations has resulted in a heated conflict with shell fisheries. This map shows that sea otters in many areas of Southeast Alaska have not yet reached carrying capacity, which increases the potential for continued human-wildlife conflict. However, understanding sea otters' positive effects on the ecosystem might help to lessen this conflict. The whale pump describes how whales dive to ocean depths to feed, and when they surface, they release these giant fecal plumes that are rich in nutrients that phytoplankton need to thrive. This helps to stimulate the base of the food web, making oceans more productive overall. And then depending on the depth at which these whales feed, this can also lead to carbon sequestration in ocean depths. So we're currently studying this in Alaska in a study funded by Whale and Dolphin Conservation. Our first step is to characterize the oceanography of the region because we need to understand this as a baseline to understand how the ocean might respond to increased nutrient input by whales. So we're measuring nutrient concentration in whale poop. We're conducting phytoplankton experiments in the lab to see if these whale nutrients are taken up by phytoplankton. This figure depicts all of the ways that whales interact with the carbon cycle through direct pathways, which are shown in gold, and indirect pathways, which are shown in white. And there's some key questions in whale carbon that have different levels of scientific confidence based on the current state of knowledge. We have fairly high confidence in estimating the amount of carbon stored in whale bodies, and then how much carbon is sequestered at depth when those carcasses sink to the seafloor. What's less certain are these indirect pathways, so these nutrient cycling roles of whales. So interestingly, the pathways in which we have less scientific confidence are likely to have greater carbon sequestration potential, but we just need to advance the science to truly understand the full carbon cycling potential of whales. And it's also worth noting that there have been recent reports by Chami et al., which have placed carbon values on whales and then scaled this up to a value of $2 to $3 million per whale, also considering other ecosystem services. There is significant scientific concern about this valuation, and this is backed up by at least 5 recent peer-reviewed publications that have all reached the same conclusion. For example, in our recent paper, we noted that recent attempts to monetize whales have garnered attention by valuing an average whale at $2 million for carbon capture and other services, and we feel that this goes beyond our current understanding of their role in the carbon cycle. Another recent study reached the same conclusion, and they find that the emplacement of a reliable scheme for carbon credits based on carbon sequestration by whales is not ready yet. So I urge that economics and policy be based on sound, rigorous science, and we need to invest in that science, again, to realize their full potential. So in closing, recovery of marine mammals can aid in some degree of carbon dioxide removal, but the scale is currently unknown. Marine mammals are also impacted by climate change themselves, so we need to cut emissions and other threats to give them a chance to recover so they can regain their full ecosystem roles. It's exciting that the role of cetaceans in ecosystem functioning has been gaining traction and been formally recognized by resolutions to the IWC and the CMS. So ultimately, I urge the precautionary approach be applied. Marine mammal conservation is a holistic ecosystem goal that is a low-risk, low-regret solution with numerous intrinsic and ecosystem benefits. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Heidi, for a very tight and very compelling presentation on where we stand with whales. I'll take your closing message that there's no downside to marine mammal conservation and potentially many upsides, and as with the science grows more sophisticated, we will have a better way of relating it to actual value. With that, I'd like to turn to Sofika Kostiniuk from Aquatic Life Institute, and you will be, I think, focusing on food systems and primarily aquatic food systems as a blocker to rewilding. Sofika.
Super. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the warm introduction and the fantastic conversations already. I'm thrilled to be here with you this afternoon in the final stretch of COP. We're going to make it through to the end, so congratulations for being here. And I wanted to thank the hosts as well as COP for including this very important conversation in the agenda. So I'm here to talk to you about the global seafood trade as it relates to marine fish and aquatic animals. And as we've already heard from Dr. Oz, marine fish very likely play a very, very important role in carbon sequestration. But there is this competition to also utilize them for food. So the global seafood trade is massive in nature. Around $424 billion of trade occurs every single year. It is the most highly traded animal protein on the planet, and it actually dwarfs that in terms of trading of beef, so 3.6 times more than beef, 5 times more than pork, and 8 times more than all poultry combined. The FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, estimates that around 17% of all protein consumed is seafood. And in various countries in Asia and Africa, that number actually exceeds 50% of all protein consumed. We're also, per capita, per year, consuming over 20 kilograms of seafood, which is a staggering figure and certainly doesn't reflect my own diet, but globally, that's the number. So this is a huge number of animals that are being removed from natural ecosystems for our own purposes. How many animals are we actually talking about? Very conservative estimates point to the fact that it's probably around 35 times more than all terrestrial farmed animals combined. So we have farmed fish, farmed shrimp, but then we also have everything that's being pulled out of the ocean. In this 2 to 3 trillion conservative estimate of aquatic animals coming out of the ocean, around a third of those are coming from IUU operations, so illegal, unregulated, unreported operations. So it's very likely that these numbers are significantly higher, but these are the best guesses that we have at present. Here are some examples of what's happening in the aquaculture space on land. There are over 100 different species of fish commonly being farmed. There's also many crustaceans and so on. We have carp, tilapia, shrimp. Just make no mistakes. These are very highly industrialized farming operations. And all of them have impacts on soil, water quality, often wildlife in surrounding waters. For example, shrimp farming is often conducted in these monoculture ponds that are in coastal ecosystems where previously likely there were mangrove forests. Many of us know that mangrove forests serve essential roles in terms of sequestering carbon. So when those are ripped out, we no longer reap those benefits. But additionally, those mangrove forests are essential breeding grounds, nurseries, for countless aquatic animals. When those are pulled out for this monoculture crop, aquaculture, we also lose that function in the ecosystem. In the ocean, we have both farming of aquatic animals and wild capture. Farming is often in these net cages or net pens. It's typically of higher value carnivorous fish like farmed salmon. And because they're carnivores, we actually need to feed them other fish to grow them out to market size. So we're feeding them anchovies, herring, sardines, and there is this hidden cost, this hidden loss that is also occurring in the marine environment that few people think about when they're buying their fillet of salmon at their Costco or going to their local restaurant to buy some salmon. In the fisheries space, there are a number of severe impacts due to the type of gear that we're using and the practices that are being employed in these operations. So we have bottom trawling, which rips up the substrate of the ocean, releasing huge amounts of sequestered carbon back into the atmosphere. We have long lining, so up to 60 kilometers of hooks on lines that are put out into the ocean that are not catching selectively. We're also catching turtles, rays, sharks, birds, huge losses of animals that way. And then there's bycatch from these very large purse seines that are essentially going out into the ocean and scooping everything up in a particular space, and it's indiscriminate. Just going to skip over that one. That's part of the solution. But in summation, I'd just like to say that it's probably becoming quite apparent that the way that our global aquatic food system is currently functioning is unsustainable. We're having all of these problems, both to the environment, but also significant negative impacts to wild animals, wild aquatic animals. And we just can't continue this way any longer. Beyond that, we're also seeing significant negative impacts to the environment and the habitat. So we're not actually allowing for those vital ecosystems to be resilient and durable that then can foster this rewilding that we so very much need. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sofika, for bringing us down to earth or down to the water once again. We started this panel by looking at the potential for using wild animals to capture and store carbon and the significant numbers attached to that. You've given us an example of a resource that is badly managed and overexploited, which has the double negative of course, wasting the potential that it has for atmospheric carbon sequestration, but at the same time destroying a resource on which a great deal could be based. So thanks for that. The final panelist is MX Sibanda from the Commonwealth Secretariat, and what Dr. Sibanda is doing is working on how you would actually build wildlife into nationally determined contributions and the national biodiversity strategies and action plans with a special focus on Africa. If we are going to make animating the carbon cycle part of climate and biodiversity action at the multilateral level, we need to figure out how to build it into the process. So, Dr. Sibanda.
Thank you very much, Mark. And it's an incredible pleasure to join this August panel and occasion and speak on behalf of the Commonwealth this morning or afternoon. I will spare you any slides because We've had enough of slides, and I'm sure you will appreciate that. I represent the Commonwealth, as I have said, and the Commonwealth brings together 56 member countries that are spread across the world, so in the Caribbean, the Pacific, Asia, and Africa. Our members are small island states, so the discussion about the role of the oceans is critical to us because we've got some of the biggest island states you can find in the world. The Commonwealth also contains some of the member countries or countries in the world that have the largest populations of herbivores on land, whether you're looking at a country like Botswana, which holds the largest population of African elephants in the world. So for us, this is a live topic, both from a survival, because for most of our island states, they are being obliterated, and if you have been reading the news, Tuvalu has had an agreement with Australia for climate refugees, because this is how we look at this topic. So climate change is high on our agenda. It's an important thing that we would like to address, and our heads of government have been leading the way, the charge on this. And in 1989 in Lanka, we were the first to talk about the environmental degradation, the issues of climate change, and why the world needs to address this as an urgent priority. I think it's important to recognize that, because I think governments in many of the high biodiversity countries really are at the front end, at the brunt of climate change. It's interesting when you look at the sorts of countries that are part of our family, and you look at also the biodiversity richness that's contained in those countries, and there is an overlap of those two. And so we've continued on that journey to really try and bring this to the attention of the world, and we're very delighted this afternoon that this event really brings to the fore and brings the animals into it, the wildlife into it. So we do know the case for that, and we're very, very passionate about the case for integrating wildlife into the climate crisis, into the talks that have been going on. And I will talk a little bit about some of the initiatives and the work that we are doing to do that going forward. But I think I'd like to highlight the fact that for us, wildlife and climate is a two-way street. So there is the effects that we've had, the potential that's there, but we also know that there is impact of climate change on animals, wildlife. And so it's very important to continue to recognize that, because for us as the Commonwealth, it gives us not just a carbon rationale for doing this, but it goes beyond that, because it's a cultural thing. I think Reem did mention at the beginning why wildlife is a cultural value, and I think we've got, as we talk about this, to remember that for countries such as in the Commonwealth, this is about our lives, this is about our culture. It's also about us, social and economic development. And I think as we continue to drum the subject of bringing wildlife into the climate discourse, we need to continue to highlight that. Whilst the food system is particularly one where you can see these interlinkages, and I think it's important that we motivate that and highlight how for us, it's a cultural thing, it's a social and economic development issue as well. Most of our countries use wildlife as a basis for their economies, and we need to acknowledge that. And I think that this overlap of biodiversity, climate, food systems highlights the importance that we need to continue to, I guess, put the science into and generate the science and the data for the discussions here. I want to talk a little bit about some of the efforts that we've been doing as the Commonwealth to try and bring this together. And I would like to say to us that we need to be thinking about this approach, which is an integrated approach, really. I think one of the things that we miss is that we have been, and I have been a biodiversity and ecologist, biodiversity specialist for years. And I think we have not yet really gotten to talk about how these things are interlinked. And at the Commonwealth, we realize the interlinkages between these things. And one of the things that we have done, last year, our heads of government brought together a charter. And this charter was really to bring climate, biodiversity, and land degradation together. And I think it's important that we continue to do that, because the way governments operate and work is oftentimes siloed, and the efforts within the Commonwealth is really to help and support the integration of this. So much that at the national level, when the governments plan how they will tackle climate change, we are able to bring these things together. And I think many of us who are working on biodiversity need to recognize the opportunities that exist in our national processes for climate in order to bring the wild animals in there. And each country, all our members have got the responsibility to revise their NBZFs. They've got responsibility to revise and report on their NDCs. They have responsibility to develop work and implementation plans for their NDCs. And the challenge, and we invite many of you in this room today to join us in addressing this challenge, is how do we integrate effectively wild animals when we do that work? When we do the projects at country level, when we plan and develop the action plans, the pipeline of projects at the country level, how do we do that? And we need to do that as an urgent priority, because we've been fighting against natural systems for the last, I don't know how many years, and it's now time to act. So as the Commonwealth, we want to invite you to join us in doing this, and look forward to a discussion of how we can do that so that animals are no longer excluded from these discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, MX, for bringing us on to the very practical point of how you actually build what we're learning and discovering about the role of animals into the official processes to enable it to be very much part of the strategy for addressing climate change and biodiversity loss. So that was a very, very useful perspective. I would like to ask the panel a number of questions, but we're running a little late, and I don't want to cut off the opportunity for the audience to also ask questions and to turn to our closing remarks speaker as well. So I will permit myself to just ask a few questions and invite you to respond very briefly. And maybe the first one to Oz. Oz, you painted a picture of the variety of animal contributions potentially to carbon sequestration, and noted that we have information on just a few of them. And the implication is the more we learn, the more animals we include, the more carbon we can sequester. The risk of that is that you paint the picture of a sort of Garden of Eden that we need to try and get to. And of course we would love to, but inevitably it'll come down to trade-offs between human use, between traditional use, and the conservation benefits. So could I ask you just to reflect on that very briefly? Oz?
Yeah, that's a very good point, Mark. You know, the big issue is that there's not enough land space in protection, under protection, in parks and protected areas to actually scale the animating the carbon cycle up and have animals be part of the solution. We need to work in lands between parks and protected areas, but that means working with local people. We can't, you know, prevent people from maintaining their livelihoods on the landscape. But it's also an opportunity, I think, to work with local communities and use their knowledge and their understanding and have them participate in the planning of how to have animals become part of the landscape and re-engage people and nature together. So again, it's a bottom-up approach. We can't come in and top down and say you need to restore this many animals and this is what needs to be done. We need to work with local communities and get their knowledge and thoughts on this. And what that may mean then is it's not really an issue of what animals to restore, but how many. And we can do, you know, the science to figure out how many more animals contribute to this much more carbon uptake. For example, in the Serengeti, you know, for every 100,000 wildebeest that you increase in abundance, you get 15% more carbon storage. So, you know, we can do the math and figure out the trade-offs, both in terms of the identity of the species, but also the numbers of species, to align that better with other human needs and values.
Thanks very much, Oz, and certainly agree on the need to involve local communities in the bottom-up approach, because in fact it is the values that these communities represent that will be your strongest ally if you get the trade-offs right, if you get the balances right. But Andrew, let me turn to you. You work a great deal in Southeast Asia, and as your map pointed out, there is a great deal of conflict between human communities and wildlife. And how can we build back animal populations for the reasons that have been set out here, while continuing to manage the sort of conflicts that we've seen? And Heidi pointed out that even when it comes to sea otters, there's conflict with the local shellfish industry and the local communities there. So managing those conflicts or building in a concept of management of those conflicts into the approach clearly seems to be essential. Do you have views on that, Andrew?
Thank you for the question. And yes, I mean, in short, any time we try to put large mammals back into an ecosystem, there's certainly potential for conflict, whether it's direct with things like tigers or indirect with animals like elephants cooperating. But I think what is key here, in my opinion, is that there are frameworks, there are international best practice guidelines for putting these species back into ecosystems. So the International Union for the Conservation of Nature has a conservation translocation specialist group that focuses on how to put species back into ecosystems in the right way. And I think adhering to those guidelines is crucial. And just to quickly play on a point that Dr. Schmitz mentioned, is that these guidelines have inherent in their framework working with local communities to get their buy-in, their guidance, their acceptance of this process. And that ultimately, that must be key to any sort of rewilding that happens, especially with large animals.
Thanks very much. And clearly, we need to use all the best practice that we have in managing those conflicts. But there are other types of conflict as well. And Sofika, I want to turn to you, that part of the problem with fisheries or extraction of food from the marine and aquatic environment is that a lot of the agreements we already have are not implemented. There's no proper enforcement. There's a lot of cheating. There's the IUU, the high proportion of IUU fisheries that you mentioned in your presentation. What's the best way to draw attention to that and put pressure on the fishery companies or those that finance them, first of all, to comply better, but also to recognize the potential for regeneration of the resource for both the resource itself and climate change?
Yeah, thank you. That is a fantastic question and a very complex situation. So you sort of touched on the challenges. There's the governance issue, and then there's the transparency, accountability, enforcement issue, and also the awareness. So it's rife with challenges. I think what needs to happen, actually, first of all, is that there needs to be a global treaty, and this consolidated way of managing or understanding our ocean. When you look at a globe, it is not a series of patchworks of seas. It is actually one unified body that surrounds the majority of the planet. So everything is interconnected, everything is interdependent, and we need to open our mindsets to begin governing in such a way that we're not fragmenting, we're not saying my jurisdiction ends at the end of the exclusive economic zone and what happens 1 mile past that is free range. We cannot afford to do that any longer, so I think there needs to be coordinated global governance, enforceability, traceability, visibility of what's going on. That will certainly begin to change the way that corporations operate. But also we need to constantly feed back from the bottom up, so from consumers, from large-scale buyers, that we need things done differently. We need climate-smart seafood. We don't need to eat those top predators if that's certainly not going to feed a hungry world. So just everyone needs to change their approach moving forward.
Thanks very much. It's, as you say, complicated. It's a challenge. MX, if I just quickly turn to you, you are trying to build this approach into the NCDs and MBZFs in Africa. What sort of reaction are you getting? Are you getting people saying, "My, this is wonderful. We really have to do that. What's the best practice in this field?" Or are you getting the reaction that, listen, we already have enough problems on our plate, and adding something else might be difficult? Are you encouraged by what you're hearing?
I think it's important to say, for us, it's our leaders that are asking for this.
Yeah.
So, last year we had a charter, Living Lands Charter, really looking at doing that. So our governments, I think, our government leaders, at least I can say this confidently, they would like to do this. Now, there are a number of barriers to doing this because it means we work differently. It means we collaborate much more at the government level, that biodiversity and climate and agriculture and, the other different departments have got to come together. And I think that's the major challenge that we've got to go through. As a secretariat, we're supporting our governments in terms of how they can rationalize their institutions and how they work together. We've got some best case studies from countries like Namibia, where they're bringing all these different organs of the government or departments together to really look at this as holistically. And I think that players like yourselves and many others in this field who are interested in animating the carbon cycle, we need to engage and support those efforts at that level. And I think that once we do that, it should be pretty natural. And I think I think we've reached a stage now where even at the global level, the three conventions recognize the importance of this. And this hasn't been mentioned quite loudly, and I think I would say we need to do that. Just a few weeks ago, the three convention presidents asked for the conventions to work together. So I think there are some positive lights. And so I think we need to all work together to enhance that and accelerate that going forward.
Thanks very much, and those are wise words. It's encouraging the extent to which, in fact, these agendas are converging, and to hear that the African leadership is demanding this is even more encouraging. Final, very quick question to Heidi. You mentioned at the end, there are two things that came out of your presentation. One was that the science is encouraging, but not yet complete enough on which to base, let's say, economic calculations of the values of whales. Nevertheless, you concluded by talking about the precautionary principle and the no downside risk. Do you see whales as a sort of potential flagship species in both advancing the science and enabling us to restore a healthy environment?
Absolutely.
It's on.
And I appreciate the question. So whales they're charismatic megafauna. Most people like or even love whales around the world. They migrate over vast distances between countries along the high seas. And so they are great flagship species for better understanding these carbon and other ecosystem benefits. And if we can understand their role, their full role in ecosystem functioning, then we will better understand other parts of the food web and their role, from phytoplankton to krill to fish on up to other marine mammals. And so I do agree that whales are an appropriate and exciting flagship species to be looking further at these scientific questions.
Thanks very much, Heidi. I'd like now to ask the audience if they have any questions to the panel. Could I ask you to keep your questions brief and targeted, and if it's specific to one of the panelists, please say so. Yes, young lady here.
Mine isn't targeted, it's like to the whole group. So I was wondering, you suggested rewilding communities and like speaking with the community to work through it. My question is, how do you suggest doing that, especially like with communities that depend on these on these animals that they've like kind of depleted for like their livelihoods or food, stuff like that?
Who would like to take that question? Perhaps Andrew? Okay. Please, no, go ahead. Go ahead.
Jump in from a fisheries perspective, and over 3 billion people around the world actually rely on seafood as their primary source of protein. So by no means are we saying those communities that are already marginalized need to cut seafood out of their diet. And it's typically not those small artisanal fishers that are creating this vast problem. It's the large industrial scale operations that are operating at magnitude compared to what's going on in the small scale communities. There's always improvements, absolutely, that can and should be made in these more dispersed artisanal fisheries, but that's not really the focus, I think, that we need to apply at this time.
You have a follow-up? Sorry, where's the microphone? A quick follow-up question.
Sorry, but like, what about the people that work in the fishery? Like, if they have to cut down, they'll lose their job. So, yeah.
I'll let Reem take this question.
I'll take this question more of, shall we say, personal experience, because we've exactly been facing that in Bahrain. Just to give you context on Bahrain, it is located here in the Arabian Gulf, and it's the third smallest nation in Asia. It is completely, I would say 98% of our people live on the coasts. And so fishing and our entire economy before the discovery of oil was completely reliant on pearl fishing. So everybody was pearling. And once fossil fuels were obviously discovered, there's been a shift in it. However, still, there was a large portion of the community that then turned into fisheries and let pearling on the side. So one of the things that we have been doing in terms of our biodiversity strategy, but also recognizing the need for socioeconomic development, because everybody still wants to be able to survive. So what we've been working on is reviving, or the revival of, the pearling sector. And now our pearling sector is not so. In Bahrain, it is banned to culture oysters and pearls. It is banned, because that is why we have always been famous. So famous that Cartier used to come to Bahrain to buy the pearls, and it is said that the best pearls in the world come from here. And so what we've been doing is we've been training, especially the young people in the families, to be able to go back to pearling and pearl diving. However, it is very much regulated. There is a cap as to how much, and what they've been doing is shifting between normal fisheries. So we also have seasons. So there's this mackerel season, a shrimp season. So what we've been doing is working with them to see how we can put the bans in place, looking at the biology and ecology of these fisheries, because some of them are migratory. And obviously, we also have the issue of shark finning that's been happening. I don't know if you know this, but actually, for example, the UAE is the 4th largest exporter of shark fins in the world to China. But there's been a lot of work once this data has come together and recognized. And so all of us came together and said, okay, well, we have an issue and we need to sort this issue. However, we also need to do it in a way where we don't harm the livelihoods of all of the people depending. I'm sure you've heard this phrase or term from many people around the world. You know, people didn't know what they were doing when they first found fossil fuels. People didn't understand the science, you know, what was going in the world on plastic. But now we know, and this is the time for change, and this is what we're trying to do. And a lot of it is trial and error, by the way. It's not picture perfect. So don't think just because I'm saying we're working with the communities, it's all going great. No, it's trial and error, and that is okay. That is okay.
Thank you. I certainly agree with that. And of course, maybe add the remark that I need to come to our wrap-up speaker. If you have a very quick question, I'm happy to do it. Please.
I came all the way here to speak about the whales. Thank you.
Speak briefly about
Yeah,
that.
briefly. So, as you know, the whales come to Tonga.
Yeah.
So this is the last destination. I'm asking you, Dr. Haite, come to Tonga, because next year the COM is going to be in Samoa, and the Pacific region is going to be in Tonga in November. So my question is this: without the whales, then you're not going to go forward with what we're going to do here. So please come to Tonga. My name is Willie Losi. I'm rushing to get to your event at 12:30. So that's the reason I've been sitting here. Mala.
Thank you. I'm sure that Heidi has registered that invitation and would, I'm sure, be delighted to go to Tonga and look at the whales there. I was just going to make the remark before I come to our closing speaker that, of course, new industries also develop. And so whales, the presence of whales leads to whale watching, whale-based tourism, ecotourism. And so it's not as if we have to be stuck in the way things always were. At the time of our ancestors, we can develop in ways that are very positive for nature as well. And with that, I would like to turn to Oriana Voters, who's part of the Aruba youth delegation to COP28. You've been listening to this panel, you've been listening to all the presentations. From your point of view, from your Caribbean island perspective, but also from the perspective of the generation that you represent here, does this speak to you? Do you see this as a viable solution to the joint challenge of climate change and biodiversity conservation?
Oh, I'll start by saying for sure. It plays a big role, and I am an ecologist, one, and a marine resources manager, two. And the takeaways that I got from these presentations today are: how are we able to harmonize human-animal interactions? That's a start. The next question is, are we creating space for nature in rewilding and regeneration? Creating a right to existence for nature? And for this to happen, a paradigm shift in development mindset is the start. This is reflected at this COP. As we've seen today, we have wildlife sitting at the table. And we've seen that there is a major gap that needs to be filled through trophic rewilding. We've been provided with examples of ecosystem functioning from the terrestrial realm and the marine realm. We've also seen that introducing natural capital and animal service valuation can help us realize the full potential in trophic rewilding. Additionally, there is a need to transform aquatic food systems. And lastly, it was expressed how wildlife can be a cultural value that gives an example of the paradigm shift that has been reflected throughout today's presentations. On my island, a small island developing state, but a large ocean state, we are limited in our land mass. We have to compete with tourism for land use. What I do with this in trophic rewilding is I have a food forest. It's a food production system that pretty much combines agriculture and forestry. What I do is I try to harmonize my relationship with nature. I take it easy and I don't focus on accelerating and maximizing production. Rather, I want to maximize biodiversity. I want to recover soil productivity by looking at my trees and plants that I introduce in the system that is a semi-arid climate that has been negatively impacted by a very complicated colonial past. And in so doing, I'm trying to recuperate these trophic systems that feed or generate soil productivity on my soils. And since the moment I implemented my very small pilot project, I've seen that an area which was pretty much desertified on the daily improved in biodiversity, not only from the trees and vegetables that I introduced in my system, but by feeding the soil, I managed to see how from one ant species that was always present, it became 4 ant species within 2 days. On the second day, I also saw dung beetles walking around in my system. On the third day, I saw spiders hunting these animals. On the fourth day, it was centipedes. On the fifth day, lizards, reptiles. And on the sixth day, more birds. And after the 3 months, I had a mystery animal. It was huge. It ate all my watermelons, but it also left its dung behind, reflecting what forests do. We've seen this in these presentations today. That mystery animal was a donkey. So on the smaller scale, what I'm trying to do is implement a climate mitigation and adaptation project that includes trophic rewilding and transforms our relationship with nature. And that's all I want to express today. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Oriana, for those very inspiring words. And I do want to underline the fact that both our opening speaker and our closing speaker insisted on the question of values, on the relationship between human activity and the environment that supports us. And you illustrated also that it can be done at any scale. Mm-hmm. You can take your farm and return it to productivity, return it to biodiversity. I think that's one of the essential messages today, that we have looked at how animals and mature ecosystems have the potential to address both the biodiversity and climate challenges together in a way that rebuilds the sort of relationship that we've all talked about as wanting with nature. So I see no better way to close this session than to thank both of you, to thank all of our panelists for bringing us really stirring examples, to Andrew and Oz, with regrets that you couldn't be with us here today, but thank you very much for your contributions. And finally, to the organizations whose logos are up on the screen, who came together to sponsor this session and who are coming away from COP28 with a determination to work much more closely together to build a real coalition so that this new science, this new approach, becomes mainstream as quickly as it possibly can. Thank you all for your presence, and with that, I close the session.